For centuries, the French and the Germans have been fighting one another. The 80-plus years since World War II is one of the longest periods of peace in European history. Millions of men, women, and children have died in the wars between these two great people, and it might have started with one man, Emperor Charlemagne, 748 to 814. The idea that Charlemagne was the root cause of the problems between the Germans and the French is far-fetched, but his son Louis the Pious divided the empire when he died in 840, and the empire his father created was divided into thirds. One son, Charles the Bold, would rule West Francia, the precursor to modern France. Louis the German would govern East Francia, which would evolve into Germany. His third son, Lothair I, held the unfortunate position of ruling Middle Francia, right in between the land of his two brothers. In medieval times, this was not a good place to be. Though many historians consider the signing of the Treaty of Verdun in 843 to be the genesis of France and Germany as we know them, the people who lived in what is now northern France, as well as parts of Belgium and Holland, were the Franks, who were actually a Germanic people who had migrated west during the decline of the Roman Empire. On the other side of the Rhine were various German tribes. One of the most powerful were the Saxons, a confederation of Germanic tribes. The Franks and the Saxons were branches of the same tree, but they might as well have been from different planets when Charlemagne became the sole king of Frankia in 768, because their cultures were completely different. The Germans east of the Rhine sometimes allied with one another, and sometimes they fought one another. The Franks were a powerful, rich, united force. The most significant difference between the two groups of people was religion. By the 500s, most of the people of France were Christian. The Germans, the Saxons, and all the others were pagans, and in the 500s, they would remain pagans until the 9th century. The pagan Saxons, who lived between Denmark, Holland, and France, and extended east to the region around the Elbe River, worshipped gods similar in many ways to the more famous gods of the Viking Scandinavians. Everyone is familiar with Odin, Frey, Thor, and the others. In the German lands south of Denmark, these gods were called Wotan, Frey was Fra, Thor was Stunar or Donar. The modern German word Donner means thunder. In 799 to 800, Charlemagne, then King of the Franks, helped Pope Leo III regain the papacy after he had been ousted and almost killed by his enemies. When Charlemagne led armies into Rome, there were no enemies powerful enough to oppose him, and Leo was returned to the throne of Peter in the Vatican. In return, Leo named Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor, the first of many. And what many saw as the return of a new golden age that had ended when the pagan hordes had destroyed the Western Roman Empire, and Charlemagne as a new Caesar. Charlemagne was many things: a brilliant organizer and charismatic leader, a great general and a very learned man, and what we today might call a fanatical Christian. But remember, Charlemagne was born in 748 and died in 814, right in the heart of what historians used to call the Dark Ages. On a pilgrimage to Rome in 754, Charlemagne's father, known to history as Pepin the Short, had then Pope Stephen II anoint Charlemagne and his older brother Carloman as joint kings to take a shared throne after Pepin's death, which occurred in 768. It doesn't take a historian to see that this arrangement would not last. As the older brother, Carloman believed he should be the only king. Soon after Pepin's death, tensions between the brothers started to grow. Charlemagne is and was recognized as being the more even-keeled and intelligent of the two, and from what we know, was the favorite of their mother, Bertrada, an intelligent and influential woman. In 771, at the age of 20, Carloman suddenly died, at the exact moment that all-out war with his brother appeared unavoidable. Of course, there were rumors that Charlemagne and/or his mother poisoned Carloman, but most historians believe that death was natural. It was also convenient for Charlemagne, who became the sole king of the Franks in 768, king of the Lombards in northern and central Italy in 774, and Holy Roman Emperor in 800. From 768 to 771, Charlemagne gained control of the lands that had belonged to Carloman, which included the borderlands with the Saxons in the north, Holland and Belgium, and Flanders in France. He also gained control over the region around Bavaria, which happened through his marriage to Desiderata, the daughter of the then king of the Lombards, who Charlemagne would later defeat in battle after he divorced Desiderata for a half-Frank, half-German princess named Hildegard. In his kingdoms, Charlemagne enacted several reforms, some of which laid the groundwork for the long period of feudalism in Europe. He established schools, built an efficient administrative system, and promoted art and higher learning. And in 772, Charlemagne started his war with the Saxons. Charlemagne, the new Caesar, had the same problems with the Saxons and other German tribes that the old Caesars had. The warlike pagan tribes of the forests, mountains, and valleys of what is now Germany spent much of their time raiding and pillaging the Christian lands of the Franks. Of course, they took captives as slaves as well. Naturally, the situation was made worse by rumors, maybe true, maybe not, that the Germans were burning Frankish women alive and all sorts of other unpleasant things. Charlemagne was not the first Frankish king to face the Saxons, but he would be the last. The revenge for current and past raids was definitely on the list of reasons why the emperor wanted to go to war with the Saxons. Economic and political factors played a role too. If Charlemagne allowed the raids, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, to go on, he would be seen as weak, and in turn, his position inside Francia would weaken. The trading posts and towns the Germans raided were important economically, as was control of the Rhine River. Defeating the Saxons and absorbing them into his empire would also give Charlemagne access to lands and wealth further east. But most important in this time of extreme religious fervor was that the Saxons were pagan, and Charlemagne and nearly every other Christian in Western Europe saw it as their duty to God to expand his kingdom on earth. Charlemagne and his inner circle thought of themselves as the new Rome, who would create peace in Europe. The biggest first step would be to crush paganism and allow the people of Western Europe to unite around Catholic Christianity, the Pope, and the Holy Roman Emperor. In January 772, a large Saxon raid on the town of Deventer in modern Holland and the sacking and burning of the church there gave Charlemagne the excuse he needed to begin his war on the pagans. In the spring, Charlemagne's troops moved into Saxon territory and conquered the Engrians, a Saxon subgroup in north-central Germany near the modern city of Paderborn. The Saxon Wars had just begun, but with his actions, Charlemagne ensured that the wars with the Saxons would be long. He did this by destroying the most revered symbol of German pagan beliefs, an Irminsul, a dedicated tree representing the Tree of Life that held the heavens above the earth. You may have heard of its Viking cousin, Yggdrasil. There wasn't just one Irminsul. Most large communities had one, and it was a place of pilgrimage and reverence. Removing an Irminsul, or worse, tearing one down, was not only symbolic, it brought the wrath of the gods down on the heads of the community. In tearing down an Irminsul in the center of Saxon territory, he was both making a statement and hopefully provoking the Saxons into fighting a larger war that Charlemagne was sure he would win. Most of the time, at least in Western Europe, armies would fight, and the commander of the losing side would surrender before he lost all of his men. Often, this also meant taking an oath to the enemy's leader and agreeing to pay him tribute and taxes, but remaining to govern as they had before. Not in this case. Charlemagne was not going to allow defeated Saxon tribes to continue as before. He was going to absorb them into the new civilization that was growing and spreading throughout Europe: Christian civilization. Converting the Saxons and any other pagans that stood in his way would mean, at least in theory, that no one, at least in Western and Central Europe, would have a reason to go to war with one another again. At least that's how Charlemagne viewed it. In 773 or 4, however, other more serious problems competed with the Saxons for Charlemagne's attention. Another Germanic tribe, this time the much stronger Christian Lombards of northern Italy, were on the warpath, attempting to assert their power in Italy, including installing a new pope, one friendly to them. So Charlemagne, at this time just the king of the Franks, made peace with several Saxon tribes after destroying several towns. In return for promises that raids into his territory would stop, he left the region and headed south to face and eventually defeat the Lombards. In Saxon Germany, a charismatic and able warrior chief named Wittukind began a new series of raids on Frankish territory along the Rhine. In 775, Charlemagne was back. Historians estimate the size of his army to be about 15,000 to 45,000 men, depending on the time of year. The Franks marched through modern Westphalia in southwest Germany, defeating Saxon warbands there, and marching east into central Germany, defeating more Saxons there. One of the most powerful Saxon chiefs surrendered to Charlemagne and agreed to be baptized. Though believing he had won peace, Charlemagne left a series of fortresses behind when he left the region again to war on the Lombards. By this time, the remaining Saxon territories were anchored on the Rhine River, opposite Holland and the area south of Denmark to about where Hanover stands today. In 776, Wittukind gathered a large army and destroyed one of the fortresses left behind by the king. Charlemagne had to return from Italy once again to defeat Wittukind's army, though Wittukind managed to escape to another pagan land, Denmark. Charlemagne had had enough. He called together a meeting of some of the most powerful and influential men in his empire at Paderborn. The point of the meeting: how to convert all of the Saxons to Christianity and kill them when they refused. A new and harsh regime was set up throughout the Saxon lands under Charlemagne's control. Spies and informants spread throughout the land. Charlemagne's espionage network included Saxon children, who were forced to get a Christian education and were encouraged to inform on their parents, perhaps for money, perhaps for food, and maybe out of true belief. Men and women who were caught practicing pagan rituals after publicly converting through baptism were often killed in the most brutal ways. Burnt at the stake alone or in a group, drowned in groups that were tied together, and it being the early Middle Ages, were probably maimed and torn apart as well. Saxon priests were killed publicly, and anyone even accused of being a witch, which was a word used for a pagan practicing their rituals, was often killed after the torture the Franks put them through to get more names. Before he left the region again in 780, Charlemagne baptized many Saxons himself, and when he left, he believed he had established a lasting peace. After 2 years of peace, Charlemagne returned and imposed a new code of law on the Saxons, a people used to making their own laws together, whether in large or small communities. These laws not only allowed for the appointment of local rulers, some of whom were Christian Saxons, but they also increased penalties for any suspected pagan activity. Once again leaving the area, this time to lead an expedition against a pagan Slavic tribe to the east, Charlemagne was gone when Wittukind and a large Saxon army defeated a Frankish army in north-central Germany, and the rebellion spread. When Charlemagne returned to Saxony, he brought along a large army. two contemporary accounts, one by Einhard, a monk who spent much of his life at Charlemagne's side, and the other by the official Royal Frankish Annals, describe a series of battles that resulted in Charlemagne's ultimate victory. At the end of this campaign, the king was said to have ordered the Saxons to deliver to him 4,500 men, a figure that Charlemagne was rumored to have taken from the biblical book of Samuel, where King David destroyed the polytheistic Moabites. It's recorded that at the massacre at Verdun, 4,500 men were beheaded. We don't know exactly how it happened, and some historians believe the number is far less, but the consensus now, as then, is that 4,500 men lost their heads. It was done by hand and was probably gruesome in the extreme. What followed the massacre was 2 years of brutal war and suppression in the conquered lands. And this included not only the atrocities mentioned earlier, but also the forced relocation of thousands of Saxons into other parts of Germany. Historians sometimes call Charlemagne's war against the Saxons a genocide. That may or may not be, but it was surely a case of ethnic cleansing at the very least. In 785, Widukind surrendered, swore loyalty to Charlemagne, and was baptized. However, rebellions continued sporadically, with one Saxon tribe, the Nordalbingians, continuing to revolt through 804, over 30 years after Charlemagne's campaign against the Saxons had begun. When the rebellion finally ended, Charlemagne had 10,000 of them forcibly removed. Some were enslaved, but most were scattered throughout the region, and their tribe ceased to exist. Today, Charlemagne is remembered as a great king, a peacemaker, and a spreader of Christianity. He redrew the map of Europe, and his legacy still lives on. He was a great king, but he was also a product of his times, which were the early Middle Ages, which were brutal.